How many Russian agents have you exposed?
Thousands.
Christo Grozev has been the driving force behind a series of stunning revelations.
It's one big puzzle. It was only when we cracked open the network that we understood the true scale of this secret killing machine.
Grozev calls it the art of reconstructing a crime based on digital breadcrumbs.
I worked as an investigative journalist, outing Russian spies and assassins and exposing the Kremlin's interference in Africa, Europe, and America. This work has obviously earned me some powerful enemies.
Breaking news from London's Central Criminal Court today. A spy ring plotting to kidnap journalist Christo Grozev and smuggle him to Russia.
I act for many journalists around the world who are targeted because of their work, including Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, Maria Ressa in the Philippines. I've got clients out of Iran, clients out of Saudi Arabia, clients out of Russia, and there is no enemy too big.
Welcome to Journalists' Hit List. Christo, Caoilfhionn, I think we're interested to spend the next 20 minutes or so just going through the threats to journalism and seeing the threats and how they've created with you. Christo, you've obviously experienced it. Caoilfhionn, you and I have experienced it. I think that's the key thing on this panel. We've all been subject to assassination threats. So, you know, without the niceties, because this really isn't a nice topic, Christo, why do you think Putin's trying to kill you?
I've given it a lot of thought, and what didn't make...
bad.
Yes, exactly. Sleepless nights. I started investigating Russian intelligence services back in 2014. I did a lot of damage to them through exposing the Skripal poisoners and so on and so forth. But I never felt or saw any evidence of a real threat to my life until the Navalny poisoning investigation. And it seems that that was the trigger which changed things for Putin for two reasons. One is that it humiliated him and his favorite agency, the FSB, by showing that they can be fooled into that confession, 1-hour confession on a phone call to Navalny that I helped organize, and of one of the poisoners. But the other thing is that it put me on the spot in domestic Russian politics because I had to explain to the Russian audience what we had found out. And a lot of media that existed at the time in Russia allowed me to speak. And it was Putin's words against mine about what happened to Navalny, and he doesn't forgive that. So
yeah, I mean, I think there's a spy ring of 6 agents that's recently been convicted at the Old Bailey of following you and planning your murder. Let's look at for a moment at where you first read their intercepted messages. The spy masters are discussing which of their spies would be best suited to killing you and how.
tomorrow we'll start testing the scenarios for an ambush. I definitely have at least one with a bit of sadistic attitude who would love to be trained how to kill. And to kill painfully, not just with one shot. Then, Marsolik writes, if we would find someone we could contract for a suicide attack on him, that would be the best. Attacks him, cuts off his head in the street, and then blows up himself. Jesus.
Jesus, indeed. Why did they follow you for years and not kill you? Do you think that was just sort of to intimidate you? They've been around you for a long time.
The initial intent was just to surveil me, find out my sources, and prove for the FSB, because that was what Putin wanted to prove, that I'm not a journalist, I'm somebody who's getting the material directly from intelligence services. In one of the chats, there's a specific mention by Yammar Sadek, the spy master. Our FSB friends want proof that he works for MI6. That's all we need. When they didn't find that, it exasperated everybody, including all the way up the food chain to Putin. So they decided, well, maybe the next thing to do is to kidnap him and bring him to Russia. At one point, they decided, oh, it's easier to kill him.
And can you just briefly tell us about the personal cost to you and the family?
Well, no, obviously, I no longer have my family. I mean, I got stuck in the United States the moment this plan was discovered. And I missed my daughter's best years before she turned 18. Fortunately, my kids are so on board with everything I do that they're helping me.
Yeah. Caoilfhionn, as I've said, this is an unusual panel in that we've all been targeted, two of us by Russians. How does Christo's story resonate with you and the journalists that you represent?
Well, first of all, what a total privilege it is to be sitting here with Christo, who, despite all of these attempts to silence him, is more resolute than ever and is such a brilliant, brave, incredible journalist. And actually... Yeah. And I think it all the time, every day when I speak to Maria Ressa, who's had these horrific threats, and of course in the way that so many female journalists have, so much of it is misogynistic, it's rape fantasies, it's violence against women, that kind of material. And again, more resolute than ever, determined to keep doing her job. But seeing those messages there, I can't help but think of many of the clients who I've had over the years whose loved ones have died because of doing this job. And actually, when you see those messages, they really resonate for me with the messages that I see posthumously when I look at Daphne Caruana Galizia, for example. And that total dehumanization, that kind of description about how someone could be trained in killing you, we see that all the time, the total dehumanizing of the journalists. I suppose I'd pick out two other key points. The first one is that no matter where in the world Christo is, they're determined to chase after him. And that's increasingly a trend which I'm now seeing. So we now live in a world in which Jamal Khashoggi, Washington Post journalist, can be dismembered in a Council of Europe state in Turkey by Saudi Arabia, in which a Ryanair plane can be hijacked in order to forcibly bring someone within jurisdiction, in which diaspora communities here in London are terrorised by Chinese shadow police stations. So increasingly we're seeing the long arm of the state being used. Now, autocratic regimes trying to silence journalists and trying to stop their work is not unusual. What is now turning into a systematic tool in autocratic regimes' weaponry is the long arm of the state targeting journalists wherever they may be. And may I give one example? We're sitting just yards away from the BBC building, and I represent over 150 BBC News Persian journalists. So these are brave, brilliant journalists who are in exile here. Many of them are dual Iranian-British nationals. And they routinely are threatened. Their lives are threatened, their families are threatened, simply for doing their job, for being journalists. And just last year, Mark, we of course had a client, Pouria Zarati, on Good Friday last year, an Iran international journalist, stabbed on the streets of London because of doing his job.
I'd like to just go a little bit further, if I may, Caoilfhionn, in the sense that there's sort of concentric circles that you're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, this is a new pattern which we're now seeing too. So what we're now seeing is, as well as regimes going after journalists wherever in the world they may be, so they're not content with simply operating within their own country, within their own borders. They're now trying to target people wherever they may be. They're also trying to target their support networks. So we see, for example, Deutsche Welle being targeted, their sources being targeted. So a journalist from Germany who spoke to a professor who gave a quote, that professor is then targeted by Iran, for example. And we also see NGOs who provide support or lawyers who provide support being targeted. It's like the kind of the Knights That Say Knee, you know, in people remember that. It's an attempt to try to cut off.
You're just showing your age now.
Well, exactly. I'm a woman of a certain age. I think there's a number of us in the room. But it does seem to me there's now an attempt to make sure that rather than just going after the journalist, you go after the journalist's family, you go after the journalist's lawyers, you go after the NGOs that speak out. And indeed, as Christo's own case shows, it was Christo's reporting, which was about threats to others, which then resulted in him becoming a target himself.
I mean, this is really insightful stuff about the new trends and those sort of concentric circles of pressure, which you've experienced as well. And I know this isn't the first time you two have shared a panel. You gave evidence to the Senate on transnational repression a couple of years ago. But you now live in exile in the US. How has the new administration affected your work, your life, and everything else there?
Well, in the predictable and unpredictable way. I no longer feel as safe as I did 2 years ago there. And, well, at that time, the United States was the place I would default to in terms of safety and would never travel to Europe. Now I'm trying to minimize my time there. And every time I re-enter the United States, I have to wonder if any of my previous tweets might cause somebody angry at, or somebody that is following Trump's messaging. And this is something I want to add to, in terms of the concentric circles. It's not, the new threats are not only from, in relation to people that are support groups of journalists. The new threats also come from people that may just decide to take vigilante justice in their understanding of what the leader wants, what the leader is messaging, and dog whistling in their own hands. And in my particular case, that may be something as innocuous as a border guard saying, "We don't want you in this country because you tweeted a sarcastic message about Elon Musk." But it could be something much worse in terms of somebody at the top of the Department of Justice taking justice in their hands and saying, "We'll hand over everybody who's wanted by Russia as a sign of goodwill to Russia." So obviously it's something that I have to think every time I re-enter the United States.
And I assume that you're seeing this. How are you seeing the geopolitical sand shifting, Caoilfhionn, in your work? I mean, visas, are people feeling vulnerable?
Yeah, so I think one of the key issues with the geopolitical sands shifting in the US for me now is that people who are immigration uncertain, so people who aren't US citizens, feel a particular risk. Now, so many of my clients are journalists and exiles. They're people who fled one regime and they've sought sanctuary elsewhere. They're people who have made their home in London, they've made their home in Washington, D.C., they've made their home in New York, and they're journalists, and they're honing their craft, and they're continuing to do their job now in their new country. And what we're now finding in the US is that many people feel that it is no longer a place of sanctuary. So, for example, we've seen threats in recent weeks that anyone who holds passports from certain countries, for example, will be at risk. Now, if you're an Afghan or if you're Iranian, and you're a journalist, you're very likely to be in the US because you're opposed to the Taliban or you're opposed to the Iranian regime, and suddenly finding that your place of safety is no longer a place of safety is a real issue. So I sit on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and that is the number one issue on which we're currently working at the moment, those individuals who are immigration uncertain. But also, of course, you've mentioned there the issue about your texts and so on when you're going across the border. I was just at the International Journalism Festival in Perugia a number of weeks ago. I know a number of people in the room were at that. And a key topic of conversation for people who were returning to the US, even when they were US nationals, was that they travelled with burner phones, that they'd taken steps to ensure that they were protected when they were going back across the border. That's the world we're now in. These kind of tactics which we've had to think about for a long time when I'm advising a client who's entering the UAE, or a client who's entering Saudi Arabia, or a client who's entering the Philippines, for example.
Kazakhstan, yes.
Exactly, are now issues that we're having to think about in Western countries too.
So these sort of geopolitical risks are clearly things that commissioners and editors need to be thinking about when they're deploying staff across borders, because if you've got confidential material, then they're going to be getting at it.
Absolutely right. And you mentioned, Jimmy Lai was mentioned in the film earlier. I mean, that's a very good example where many people are still stuck in considering Hong Kong in the way that it was 10 years ago, as if it's a place which is a place of safety, a haven in the region, and a place where it's safe to do business. And actually now, under the shadow of the national security law, everyone is at risk, because once you run a company in Hong Kong, and once you have any individual member of your company who, for example, has posted a tweet or an X, has X'd an X, whatever you call it now. I told you I was a woman of a certain age. I can't even use the right phraseology.
That is the right phraseology.
You can be in a situation where just because you've had an employee who's, for example, liked an Amnesty International post or liked a post from the Committee to Protect Journalists, you could then be in a position where huge swathes of your material could be seized, could be gone through, and there's real business risks. We need to start thinking in a very different way, and companies need to start thinking in a very different way.
Well, I think it's really interesting how quietly some businesses like the New York Times have left Hong Kong and gone to Bangkok and others. And I think that's presumably because of those kinds of risks. Christo, what do you think are the biggest threats to journalism that people should be thinking about right now?
I've been asked this question at several forums in the last 6 months, and my pet peeve answer is, I think it's the creation of a bubbleized society in the United States and Western Europe through the creation of way too many paywalls. Mm-hmm. And I think that leads to the same thing that happened in Russia when I was witnessing that sort of disappearance of the homeopathic free press that existed there. And the way it happened there is through the government encouraging, in that case, it was centrally encouraging sort of separate bubbles. They don't cross over to one another. The majority bubble that is watching state television and is getting a very homogeneous version of events. And then a small bubble of liberal media that was contained to one radio station, one newspaper, that had all the freedom, almost all the freedom to say anything they wanted. But there was literally no osmosis between the two audiences. And that was encouraged because people were afraid, people who were not part of the liberal bubble were afraid to listen to those radio stations, lest they be heard and reported. So that created a firewall. And with the new paywall system, and unfortunately even CNN has gone in the direction of paywalling, I think the same lack of osmosis will be happening. I'm not saying that before that you would have a lot of Fox News people that would go to CNN to get the news from there, because they wouldn't. But there was a on-the-fence part of the society, which is the part of society that actually makes the political change in any country, that would be checking the CNN version of news and then be equipped with an inventory of responses around the family dinner, around the water cooler conversation, to counter the other side. And that's missing now.
Yeah, so essentially you've got these silos which are self-identifying.
Correct.
And then reinforcing one another, but we're not in the sort of democratic theory receiving all shades of colours of opinion and then making up our minds on the day.
Even worse, I mean, one part, the majority part, let's say the part that aligned with the current administration, is getting all the arguments from their podcasters, conspiracy theorists from Fox News, and they can argue their way loudly. And the other side, a small core has the answers, but the large majority of that part of the population will not be encouraged to actually pay $3 a week to get the news.
What's the answer? Is it a sort of shift to YouTube? We heard a couple of panels ago people talking about YouTube and the democratization of information through there. Is that the answer? Is that how people monetize the news going forward?
That is one of the answers, and not being afraid to go where previously was considered lowbrow, going into TikTok and for news, to create news and disperse news. My son, actually, my kids told me, Dad, your investigations are only read by the people who already believe what you're saying. If you want to have an impact, let us convert them to short videos. And that's what's happening now. And I'm getting million views on YouTube. And I think that's one answer.
I love how he's confessing here to child labour.
Keelan, I wanted to talk a bit about Jimmy Lai and, are there any positive... I mean, this has been a pretty depressing panel. I know that both you and I, Christo, deal with the threats we've had with gallows humour.
And then, as I told you earlier, I mean, I do that the same. And I believe that the best version to tell these stories and not go crazy is to convert them into comedies. And I'm working on a black comedy version of The Six Spies Who Tried to Kill Me. Watch it in cinemas next year.
And actually on that, one example, I mean, I was given a warning about risks to me and to my family because of being targeted by the Chinese state, because of my work on Jimmy Lai. And one piece of advice I was given by counterterrorism officials related to the risk that my kids would be targeted through video games. And I had to sit down my 14-year-old to talk to my 14-year-old and go through a script and kind of say, you know, have any of these things happened when you've been playing certain games? And during
That's a significant sanction on you.
Absolutely. But I saw his eyes glaze over, and at one point he said, can I check, does the Chinese Communist Party pay someone to play Fortnite all day? And suddenly you could see him thinking, this is a great career opportunity. So not quite sure that's what they intended to do, but certainly been added to his list of career guidance options.
So just in the last couple of minutes, Caoilfhionn, can you pluck anything that's positive out of this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it sounds like you do sad journalism, I do sad law. You know, I appreciate this all sounds quite depressing. But I would say, I mean, the best thing you can possibly do is on a day when you have someone who's been detained in prison and when you can bring them home to their family, that is what gets me out of bed in the morning. And I know other people in the room do that too. And this time last year, when we were speaking, one of my cases involved a rapper, an Iranian rapper, Tumaj Salahi, who had been given the death penalty in Iran because of his music, because of standing up and speaking truth to power in Iran. And a number of months later, we got the death penalty overturned. And we then got him, in October, we got him freed from prison. And that's what makes this job worth it. And if I can say a positive, I would say this. We know the enemies of media freedom are creative. We have got to get far more creative too. They operate cross-border. We need to operate cross-border too. And there are real opportunities here. We've seen in the last year an incredible set of releases from Russia at a time when war is waging through international collaboration. So multiple countries working together, including the US, Canada, Germany, and getting creative. We need to do that too. And I also think there's a real positive here. Many people today have been understandably criticising aspects of the Trump administration, but a top priority of the Trump administration is bringing people home to their families. And actually, one way in which we can work with the administration is with SPIHA, we can ensure that actually we're using that political will in order to get good stories and bring people home in the way that we saw in August from Russia.
You've just saved the most depressing panel of the day from being exactly that. Christo, Caoilfhionn, you're incredibly brave. Thank you so much for Journalism's Hit List.
Thank you.